London is shrouded in fog. Where others see chaos, he finds the truth. The legendary detective Sherlock Holmes is back. Welcome to the channel. Put on your headphones, like the video, and subscribe. Let's begin. It was on a morning of such unremarkable greyness that one might have expected nothing more stirring than the arrival of the post or the distant clatter of a costermonger's cart, that the most singular case of my professional association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes first presented itself. London lay beneath a low, sullen sky, the sort that pressed upon the spirits and reduced even the liveliest thoroughfares to corridors of damp stone and reluctant humanity. A thin rain had fallen in the early hours, leaving the pavements darkened and reflective, so that the gas lamps still burned, though it was well past 9 o'clock. From the windows of our rooms in Baker Street, I observed passers-by, hurrying with collars turned up and heads bent, each man intent upon his own small errands, unconscious that the city itself was about to be disturbed by a question more unsettling than any common crime. Holmes, as was his habit, had been awake long before I rose. I found him seated in his armchair, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes fixed not upon the fire, which had burnt low, but upon a sheaf of papers spread neatly across the small table at his side. His pipe lay cold and forgotten, an unusual circumstance which alone would have sufficed to alert me that his thoughts were deeply engaged. The violin rested untouched in its case, and the air of the room carried none of those improvisations which so often accompanied his periods of intense reflection. "You are up earlier than usual, Watson," he remarked without looking up. "That suggests either a restless night or a mind already troubled by anticipation." "I slept well enough," I replied, though I confess the sight of him thus absorbed gave me pause. "But I see you have not. Is there a case?" "There is," he said, at last lifting his gaze to mine. "Or rather, there is the outline of one. A shape without substance. A shadow cast by something which may or may not exist." I had learned, through long experience, that such elliptical remarks were not intended to mystify for their own sake, but to test the ground of my curiosity. I therefore seated myself opposite him and waited. He reached for the papers and passed them across the table. "Read," he said, "and tell me what you make of it." The documents consisted of several newspaper clippings, neatly trimmed and dated. All were from reputable London journals, the Times, the Daily Chronicle, and the Morning Post among them, and all referred, in varying tones of restraint or quiet astonishment, to the same matter. The headline which caught my eye first was the most restrained of the lot: "Presumed death of Mr. Julian Markham, K.C." I read on with increasing interest. Julian Markham, King's Counsel, a barrister of considerable distinction and no small influence, had not been seen for 11 days. His chambers at the Temple stood locked and undisturbed. His house in Bloomsbury had been found empty, his bed unslept in. His clerk testified that Mr. Markham had left chambers at his usual hour, remarking upon an appointment which he did not name, and had not returned. No trace of violence had been discovered. No note had been found. His bank accounts remained untouched. Yet, most remarkably of all, the article concluded with the assertion that proceedings were already underway, which might, under certain legal interpretations, allow for a declaration of death in the absence of a body. I looked up from the papers. "This is unusual," I said. But men do disappear. One thinks of suicide, perhaps, or flight. Precisely the conclusions which the public will reach, Holmes replied, and therefore the least interesting. Go on. The subsequent clippings added little in the way of concrete fact, but much in the way of speculation. There were references to a recent alteration of Mr. Markham's will, rumours of professional enemies, and vague hints, unsupported by evidence, of a private scandal. One column, written with the coy knowingness of the society pages, suggested that the barrister's domestic arrangements had long been irregular, though no particulars were offered. But there is no body, I said again, tapping the page. No scene of violence, not even a credible witness to his death. And yet, said Holmes quietly, the machinery of death has been set in motion. He rose and began to pace the room, his hands clasped behind his back. Consider this, Watson. Our entire conception of murder rests upon physical finality. A body, a wound, a cause. Remove the body, and you remove certainty. And yet, here we have a man whom society is preparing to bury without so much as a drop of blood to sanctify the grave. You speak as though you doubt his death. I doubt nothing, Holmes replied. I question everything. There is a distinction. Before I could press him further, a sharp knock sounded at the door below, followed by the familiar footfall of Mrs. Hudson ascending the stairs. She entered with a card upon her tray. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "He seems greatly agitated." Holmes took the card and glanced at it. His eyebrows rose a fraction, an expression which, in him, signified surprise of no ordinary kind. "Show him up at once," he said. The visitor who entered our sitting room was a man of perhaps 40 years, spare of build and carefully dressed, though his attire bore the subtle disarrangement of one who has dressed in haste and with a distracted mind. His face was pale, his eyes restless, and his hands, when he removed his gloves, trembled despite his evident effort to control them. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. "At your service." "My name is Edward Harcourt," the man said. Was an associate of Julian Markham." Holmes gestured him to a chair. "You have come about his disappearance." "I have come," Harcourt replied, lowering himself stiffly, "because everyone else insists upon calling it his death." A silence followed, heavy and expectant. Outside, a hansom cab rattled past, its sound momentarily amplified by the wet street. Holmes leaned forward, his expression attentive but guarded. "You do not believe him dead?" "I believe," said Harcourt slowly, "that something far worse has occurred." In the minutes that followed, he spoke haltingly, as though struggling to give shape to thoughts that resisted articulation. "Markham," he said, "had been under unusual strain in recent weeks. He had spoken of being watched, of documents altered without his knowledge, of conversations remembered by others but forgotten by himself. There had been, too, a peculiar incident involving a clock, an expensive French timepiece in Markham's study, which had been found running consistently slow, though no fault could be discovered. These may seem trivial," Harcourt said, his voice strained, "but taken together, they suggest design," Holmes finished. "Not violence, perhaps, but intention." Harcourt stared at him. "Then you will take the case?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he turned to the window and looked out upon the dim, restless street, as though seeking in its shifting forms some reflection of the problem before him. murder without a body, he murmured, or a disappearance without escape. Yes, Mr. Harcourt, I think London has need of us. As he spoke, I felt that peculiar tightening in the chest which always accompanied the beginning of a great case. The sense that one stood at the edge of a labyrinth whose paths would lead not merely through alleys and drawing rooms, but through the darker corridors of the human mind. And yet, even then, I could not have imagined how completely this affair would unsettle our notions of life, death, and proof itself. For as Mr. Harcourt rose to take his leave, he paused at the door and turned back. "There is one more thing," he said. "Yesterday I received a letter in Markham's hand, dated 2 days after he was last seen. Holmes's eyes met mine, and in their depths I saw not triumph, but something far more troubling, the gleam of a mystery which promised no easy answers." "And what," Holmes asked softly, "did the letter say?" Harcourt swallowed. "It said only this: they will prove me dead before I have time to live again." With that, he was gone, leaving behind a question which echoed in the room long after the sound of his footsteps had faded. The departure of Mr. Edward Harcourt left our sitting room steeped in a silence so dense that even the faint ticking of the mantel clock assumed an exaggerated importance. Holmes remained standing where he was, one long hand resting upon the back of his chair, his gaze fixed upon the closed door as though he expected it to open again and admit some further revelation. For my own part, I felt that peculiar mixture of excitement and disquiet which always accompanied the introduction of an element that defied ordinary explanation. A letter written by a man after the moment of his disappearance, and received, moreover, without any clear indication of its means of delivery, was not a circumstance to be lightly dismissed. "Well, Holmes," I said at length, "this case appears determined to abandon the conventional at the very outset." He smiled faintly, though there was no mirth in it. "On the contrary, Watson, it clings desperately to convention. Society insists upon patterns. When a man vanishes, it must be suicide, flight, or murder. When none of these can be proven, society grows impatient and invents proof. The remarkable thing here is not that Mr. Markham has been declared dead in the absence of a body, but that the declaration is being accepted with such alacrity. You suspect haste? I suspect convenience." He returned to his chair and at last relit his pipe, drawing upon it slowly, the smoke curling upward in thin blue threads that seemed to mirror the convolutions of his thought. "Let us begin," he continued, "with the letter. Harcourt did not bring it with him, which suggests either carelessness or fear. I incline toward the latter. A man does not lightly part with a document which contradicts the prevailing narrative of a death. You propose to see it. Without delay. But first, we must establish the conditions under which it was received. A letter has weight, texture, scent. It passes through hands. Each hand leaves a trace. I confess that this calm confidence was reassuring. Already the notion that a man could be killed, or declared so, without the crude finality of violence had begun to trouble me in a way I could not fully articulate. There was something profoundly unsettling in the idea that death itself might be reduced to an administrative act, effected by documents, witnesses, and time. Within the hour, we had engaged a hansom and were rattling eastward through the damp streets. The rain had resumed, fine and persistent, blurring the outlines of the city and lending to every gaslit window an air of secrecy. Holmes sat opposite me, his chin resting upon his hand, his eyes half closed. I knew better than to interrupt him, for this was the outward sign of an inward activity more intense than any conversation. Harcourt's chambers were situated near Gray's Inn, in a sober brick building whose respectability was unmarred by any architectural flourish. We were admitted by a clerk who eyed us with frank curiosity and shown into a plainly furnished room whose orderliness struck me at once. Everything lay in its place. There were no signs of agitation or neglect. Harcourt himself greeted us with visible relief. "I had hoped you would come," he said. "Since leaving Baker Street, I have scarcely been able to sit still." "Then you will not object," Holmes replied, "to satisfying my curiosity at once. The letter, if you please." Harcourt hesitated only a moment before crossing to a small escritoire and unlocking a drawer. From it, he withdrew a single sheet of paper, folded once, and handed it to Holmes with a care that suggested both reverence and dread. Holmes did not open it immediately. Instead, he examined the envelope with meticulous attention, noting its dimensions, the quality of the paper, the impression left by the seal. "No postmark," he observed. "And yet you say it was delivered?" "Yes. It was among my morning correspondence, left upon my desk with the rest." "By whom?" "I do not know. The clerk insists he noticed nothing unusual." Holmes nodded and at last unfolded the letter. I leaned forward, eager to read the words which had already assumed such importance in our minds. The handwriting was firm and familiar, matching precisely the samples of Markham's hand which I had seen reproduced in legal documents. The ink was black, neither faded nor overbold. The message itself was brief, almost stark in its simplicity. "They will prove me dead before I have time to live again. Trust no clock, no paper, and no memory that is not your own." Holmes read it twice, then a third time before passing it to me. "Observe," he said quietly, "what is not said as much as what is." "There is no request for help," I remarked. "No explanation, only a warning." "Precisely. And warnings are issued only when the danger is already in motion." He returned the letter to the table and began to question Harcourt with methodical patience. When had he last seen Markham? Had the barrister spoken of enemies? Had he mentioned any dispute, professional or personal, which might explain a desire to see him removed? If not physically, then socially. Harcourt answered as fully as he could, though much of his testimony served only to deepen the mystery. Markham had been cautious, even secretive, but not fearful. He had continued his work, attended his clubs, argued his cases with undiminished brilliance. There had been no overt threats, no scandal sufficiently grave to justify flight. And yet, Harcourt added, there was a change, a sense that he was being prepared, as though events were being arranged around him without his consent. Holmes's eyes sharpened at this. Arranged how? In small ways. Appointments recorded that he did not recall making. Letters answered in his name, which he swore he had never seen. Even conversations. Friends who insisted upon meetings that he could not remember attending. A campaign of confusion, Holmes murmured. Identity eroded by inches. When we left Harcourt's chambers, night had already fallen. The street lamps glimmered upon the wet pavement, and the air carried the chill of approaching winter. As we walked, Holmes remained unusually silent, his thoughts evidently pursuing a line invisible to me. At last, he spoke. "Watson, what do you know of the law concerning presumed death?" "Very little," I admitted. "Only that it requires time, and usually the absence of communication." "Time," he repeated, "and communication. Now consider a case in which time itself is made unreliable and communication manipulated. If a man's letters are intercepted, his presence misrecorded, his habits subtly altered in the minds of others, how long before he becomes, in effect, a ghost?" "You suggest," I said slowly, "that Markham may be alive, yet already regarded as dead." "I suggest nothing," Holmes replied. "I observe that such a condition would be uniquely advantageous to certain parties." "Such as?" "That," he said, stopping beneath a lamp and turning to face me, "is what we must discover." We returned to Baker Street with more questions than answers. Holmes immediately set about consulting a variety of reference works, from legal treatises to railway timetables, while I recorded the day's events in my notes. Yet, even as I wrote, I could not shake the uneasy feeling that we were already behind, that the machinery which sought to erase Julian Markham was grinding inexorably onward. Near midnight, Holmes closed his book with a decisive snap. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall visit the temple. There are places where a man's life is measured not in heartbeats, but in documents. If Markham is being killed, Watson, it is there that the weapon will be found. And if he is already dead," Holmes's expression was grave, "then we must learn how a man may be murdered without ever dying." He extinguished the lamp, leaving the room in darkness. Yet sleep did not come easily to me that night, for my thoughts were haunted by the image of a letter that denied its own impossibility, and by the troubling suspicion that in this case the absence of a body was not a failure of evidence, but the very heart of the crime. The morning broke with a reluctant pallor, as though London itself were loath to illuminate the matters that awaited us. A thin mist hung over the streets, softening the outlines of buildings and lending to every sound a muffled quality, so that hoofbeats and voices seemed to come from a distance greater than their true origin. Holmes and I breakfasted in near silence. He was already dressed and alert when I entered the sitting room, his energy in marked contrast to the somnolent city beyond our windows. "The temple," he said, folding his newspaper with precise deliberation. "It is a curious enclave, Watson. Neither wholly public nor wholly private. A place where men disappear into paperwork and emerge transformed by precedent." We set out shortly thereafter, walking rather than taking a cab, for Holmes declared that the exercise would assist his thoughts. The Strand was already alive with traffic, clerks hurrying toward their offices, newsboys crying the morning's headlines. Among them, I noted with a faint tightening of the chest yet another reference to the late Julian Markham. The word struck me as premature, even presumptuous, and I wondered how many times it must be repeated before it acquired the force of truth. As we passed beneath the ancient gateway and entered the precincts of the temple, a distinct change came over the atmosphere. The roar of the city faded, replaced by a hush broken only by the echo of footsteps upon stone. The buildings stood close and austere, their brick facades bearing the accumulated gravity of centuries of argument and judgment. Here, if anywhere, a man's existence might be reduced to ink and parchment. Holmes led the way unerringly to Markham's chambers. The door was locked as Harcourt had described and bore no sign of forced entry. Holmes examined the lock with care, noting the absence of scratches or fresh impressions. "Untouched," he murmured. "Either no one has entered since Markham's departure, or the one who did was entitled to do so." We were admitted at length by a porter who, upon learning Holmes's name, displayed a mixture of curiosity and deference. Inside, the chambers were dim and cool, the air heavy with the scent of leather bindings and old paper. Dust lay undisturbed upon the surfaces, save where Markham's clerk had evidently conducted a perfunctory inspection. Holmes moved through the rooms with quiet intensity, his gaze alighting upon details that would have escaped a less practiced eye. He paused before the desk, running a finger along its edge, then straightened abruptly. "Watson," he said, "observe the chair." I looked. The leather seat bore a faint indentation, as though someone had recently sat there for a prolonged period. "But Markham has been gone for days," I said. "Precisely. Either the clerk is heavier than he appears, or someone else has been using this room." He turned his attention to the shelves, scanning titles and volumes with rapid comprehension. At last, he selected a ledger and opened it upon the desk. It contained records of appointments and consultations, meticulously kept. "Do you see?" he asked. I bent closer. Several entries had been struck through, overwritten in a different hand, though with an effort at imitation. Dates altered by a day here, an hour there. "Someone has been revising his past," I said. "Or constructing a future in which Markham's absence is already accounted for," Holmes replied. "These changes are subtle. They would escape notice unless one were intimately familiar with his habits." "An inside hand, then?" "Likely so." As we continued our examination, a man entered quietly, a senior clerk by his dress and bearing. He introduced himself as Mr. Llewellyn and expressed polite surprise at our presence. "You are investigating Mr. Markham's disappearance?" he asked. "Among other things," Holmes replied. "Perhaps you can assist us. When did you last see him?" Llewellyn considered. "On the Monday, week before last. He left at his usual hour." "Did he appear troubled?" "No more than any man burdened with important cases." "And since then?" "Nothing. No letters, no instructions. It is most irregular." Holmes fixed him with a steady gaze. "Irregular enough to warrant alterations to his appointment ledger." A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed Llewellyn's face. "Certain corrections were necessary. Clients expect accuracy." "Corrections made in a hand not his own." Llewellyn stiffened. "I acted in the firm's best interest." Holmes inclined his head. "I do not doubt it. Yet I wonder whose interest is best served by ensuring that Mr. Markham appears to have completed obligations he never attended." The clerk made no reply, but his silence spoke volumes. We left the chambers with a sense of unease deepened rather than relieved. Outside, the mist had thinned, revealing a pale sun that cast long, distorted shadows across the courtyard. "Holmes," I said, "this suggests preparation, as though Markham's absence were anticipated." "Indeed, but preparation alone does not explain the letter." "Nor the clock," I added, recalling Harcourt's remark. Holmes halted. Ah, the clock. Time is the one witness no one thinks to interrogate. We proceeded to Markham's residence in Bloomsbury, a respectable house in a quiet square. The servants admitted us with visible discomfort. They had already endured inquiries from the police and were plainly weary of the attention. The study lay at the rear of the house, overlooking a small garden now stripped bare by autumn. Upon the mantel stood the French clock Harcourt had mentioned, an ornate thing of gilt and enamel, its face delicately painted. Holmes examined it with keen interest. "You say it runs slow." "So we thought," said the housekeeper. "But sometimes it gains. We had it seen to." "By whom?" "A man recommended by the jeweller. He came twice." Holmes nodded. "And did Mr. Markham note the irregularity?" "He complained of it often," she replied. "Said it made him doubt himself." Holmes opened the clock's casing. Inside, he found nothing overtly amiss, yet his expression grew more intent. "This is no accident," he said softly. "The clock is accurate when left alone, but it has been tampered with." "To what end?" I asked. "To introduce doubt. A man who cannot trust time cannot trust memory, and a man who cannot trust memory can be made to accept any narrative imposed upon him." We left the house with the image of that innocent-seeming clock lingering in my mind, its ticking now invested with a sinister significance. As we returned toward Baker Street, Holmes remained silent, his mind clearly racing ahead. At last, he spoke. "Watson, consider this. If one wished to destroy a man utterly without bloodshed, one might do so by convincing the world, and perhaps the man himself, that he no longer exists." "You mean," I said slowly, "that Markham's death may be a fiction so complete that it becomes real?" "Exactly. And the most dangerous fiction is one supported by documents, witnesses, and time." We had nearly reached home when Holmes stopped short, his hand upon my arm. He pointed to a figure standing across the street, a man watching our building with apparent interest. The man turned away abruptly when he saw us observe him, disappearing into the crowd. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "It appears, Watson, that our inquiries have not gone unnoticed." "And that?" I asked. "That," he replied, "is confirmation that we are close to something worth hiding." As we mounted the steps to Baker Street, I felt the weight of the case pressing ever more heavily upon me. Somewhere in London, a man might be alive who was already being mourned. Or worse, he might be dead in a manner so subtle that death itself had become indistinguishable from life's absence. Either way, the silence surrounding Julian Markham was growing louder by the hour. The incident of the watcher across Baker Street lingered in my thoughts long after we had ascended to our rooms. Holmes, however, appeared less concerned by the fact of being observed than by the implications it carried. That evening, he took unusual care in securing the door and windows, and when at last he settled into his chair, it was with an alertness that suggested a man expecting interruption rather than repose. "We are no longer alone with the problem, Watson," he said as he filled his pipe. "That is always a critical juncture in any investigation. When an adversary takes notice, the tempo changes." "Do you believe we are already suspected of something?" I asked. "Of curiosity, certainly. Of interference, perhaps, but not yet of comprehension. The latter, when it comes, will provoke action." I could not help but glance toward the window, half expecting to see the shadow of our watcher reappear upon the pavement below. Yet the street lay quiet, the gas lamps standing like solitary sentinels in the mist. Holmes spent the remainder of the evening engaged in correspondence. He wrote letters in several hands, sealed them with different impressions, and instructed me to post them at various times the following day. When I inquired as to their purpose, he merely smiled. "Bait," he said. "Cast widely and see what stirs." The next morning brought with it a new development, conveyed with the efficiency of the morning post. Among the letters addressed to Holmes was one bearing the crest of a solicitor's firm, whose name I recognized from the newspaper accounts of the Markham affair. Holmes read it quickly, then passed it to me. It was an invitation, couched in the politest legal language, for Mr. Holmes to attend a consultation regarding certain ambiguities arising from the presumed decease of Mr. Julian Markham, K.C. The firm, it appeared, represented interests connected with Markham's estate. "They seek your opinion?" I asked. "They seek my acquiescence," Holmes replied. "There is a difference." The meeting was arranged for that afternoon at offices overlooking Lincoln's Inn Fields. The building itself was imposing, its stone frontage conveying an air of authority that seemed designed to discourage dissent. We were shown into a spacious room where 3 men awaited us, 2 solicitors of advanced years and careful demeanor, and a third whose presence immediately struck me as incongruous. He was younger than the others, perhaps in his early 30s, fashionably dressed with an expression of restless confidence. His eyes, sharp and assessing, flicked from Holmes to me and back again with barely concealed interest. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said the elder of the solicitors, rising. "We are grateful you could attend. This is Mr. Lionel Vane, a beneficiary under Mr. Markham's will." Holmes inclined his head. "Beneficiary," he repeated. "An interesting designation, given the circumstances." Vane smiled thinly. "The law must proceed, Mr. Holmes, regardless of sentiment." "And yet, sentiment often precedes the law," Holmes replied, "especially where death is presumed rather than proven." The consultation that followed was conducted with a careful avoidance of direct assertion. The solicitors spoke of timelines, of precedents, of the necessity of closure. Vane listened, occasionally interjecting with remarks that struck me as prematurely confident. At last, Holmes leaned forward. "Gentlemen," he said, "you are constructing a legal edifice upon an absence. I should like to know what foundation you propose to lay beneath it." "The absence itself," one solicitor replied. "Mr. Markham has not been seen. His affairs are unattended. His associates concede his disappearance." "Disappearance is not death," Holmes said quietly. Vane's eyes flashed. "It is, when prolonged." "How prolonged?" Holmes asked. 11 days? 12? "There are indications," Vane said, "that Mr. Markham intended to remove himself." "Indications supplied by whom?" "By circumstance." Holmes smiled. "Circumstance is an eloquent liar." The meeting concluded without resolution, but not without consequence. As we departed, I noticed Vane lingering behind, his gaze fixed upon Holmes with an intensity that bordered upon hostility. "He is impatient," Holmes observed once we were outside. "Impatience is the mark of a man whose expectations are in danger." "Do you believe him capable of murder?" "I believe him capable of benefiting from death," Holmes replied. "That is a different question." That evening, Holmes received another letter, this one delivered by hand. It bore no seal, and the paper was coarse. The message, written in a cramped hand, consisted of a single sentence. "Stop looking for what does not exist." Holmes read it with evident interest. "A warning," he said, "or a plea." "From whom?" I asked. "From someone who fears that existence is precisely what we may yet uncover." The following days were marked by a series of small but telling incidents. Holmes's letters produced results. A railway clerk came forward with the recollection of a man matching Markham's description, boarding a late train, but on a date inconsistent with the accepted timeline. A bookseller recalled selling a legal volume to a gentleman who gave Markham's name, but paid in cash and declined a receipt. Each fragment, taken alone, was inconclusive. Together, they suggested movement where none was supposed to exist. Yet, for every hint of life, there arose an opposing sign. A witness emerged who swore to having seen Markham enter the Thames late one evening. Another claimed to have heard him speak of despair. The newspapers seized upon these accounts with unseemly enthusiasm, and soon the narrative of suicide gained traction. "They are drowning him in words," I remarked bitterly as I read the latest column. Holmes nodded. "Words are cheaper than water." One night, as we sat reviewing our notes, a sudden commotion arose below. The sound of hurried footsteps, a muffled exclamation, and then silence. Holmes was on his feet in an instant, revolver in hand. We rushed downstairs to find Mrs. Hudson pale and shaken. "A man," she said. "He tried to force his way in. When I cried out, he fled." Holmes examined the door, then the street beyond. "Not an attempt at entry," he said. "An attempt at intimidation. To frighten us away, to measure our resolve." As we returned upstairs, Holmes's expression was grave. "Watson," he said, "the net is tightening. But whether it tightens around a murderer or around a man already half erased remains to be seen." That night, as I lay awake listening to the distant sounds of the city, I found myself haunted by a single question. If Julian Markham still lived, how long could a man endure the world's insistence upon his death before he began to believe it himself? And if he were already dead, what manner of crime could leave behind so many footprints, and yet no body at all? The next few days passed with a strange, almost oppressive urgency. The streets of London seemed to shift under the weight of the mystery surrounding Julian Markham, as though the very air was thick with the sense of something unsaid, something unsettling, that would, sooner or later, manifest in full. Holmes was as diligent as ever, his mind moving rapidly between theories, his every moment consumed by the case. But I could see that even he, for all his intellectual superiority, had begun to wrestle with an idea that was not merely troubling, but near impossible to accept. It was during one such moment of quiet tension in Baker Street that Holmes turned abruptly to me, his eyes flashing with something like revelation. "Watson," he said, "consider this. What if Markham is neither alive nor dead in the conventional sense? What if, in fact, he has been erased from time itself?" I blinked, unsure whether I had heard him correctly. "Erased?" "Yes," Holmes replied. "Not killed, not gone into hiding, but removed, deliberately, systematically, so that he no longer exists in any meaningful way. Not in the eyes of the law, not in the eyes of his friends, his colleagues, or even himself." I paused, my mind racing to grasp the implications. "You mean Someone has fabricated his disappearance to such an extent that even his memory is being altered. Precisely, Holmes said, his voice steady. A man's death, or rather the perception of it, can be as powerful as his actual death. Once a man is presumed dead, his absence becomes the overriding truth, and all things are bent to that truth. But the truth, Watson, is not always the truth. I considered this for a moment, the idea slowly unfurling in my mind. If what Holmes suggested were true, then Julian Markham's disappearance was not simply a matter of a missing person. It was a case of a man who had been made invisible, rendered untouchable, not by the actions of a murderer, but by a conspiracy of omission and misdirection. There are dangers, I said quietly, in manipulating the truth so thoroughly. The longer Markham is absent, the more the world will accept it. And once the world has accepted it, it will be nearly impossible to bring him back. Exactly, Holmes said, his voice filled with a kind of quiet certainty. And that is the danger, Watson. If Markham has been removed in this manner, the stakes are higher than anyone realizes. We are not dealing with a simple disappearance, but with a crime that undermines the very fabric of our understanding of life, death, and identity. I stood up, pacing the room as I tried to follow Holmes's reasoning. It was a concept so radical that it seemed almost inconceivable. How could one erase a man in such a manner? And why? What would be the purpose of such an elaborate scheme? Holmes's gaze was far away, his mind clearly 1,000 miles ahead of me. He had already moved past the idea of a simple disappearance or death. The nature of Markham's case had, in Holmes's estimation, transcended the boundaries of the ordinary and entered the realm of the extraordinary. What was at stake now, it seemed, was not simply finding Markham, but unraveling a conspiracy so vast that it would call into question everything we knew about justice and truth. The next morning, we received word that Harcourt had requested another meeting. His voice on the telephone was unsteady, and there was an odd note of urgency in his tone. "Mr. Holmes," he said, I have discovered something that may be of great importance. Please, come at once." We wasted no time in setting out for his office. Harcourt was already waiting when we arrived, pacing nervously at the window, his eyes darting about as if expecting someone to arrive at any moment. "What is it?" Holmes asked without preamble. Harcourt looked at him, his face drawn with worry. "It's about Markham," he said, his voice low. "I've been digging into his affairs again, trying to find some clue, something that might explain all of this. And I've found something, Holmes, but I'm not sure what it means." He handed Holmes a bundle of papers, documents that seemed to have been hastily assembled. Holmes's eyes scanned them quickly, moving over the words with the sharpness of a man who had long since trained his mind to extract meaning from the smallest of details. His brow furrowed as he read, and I could see the shift in his posture as he became absorbed in the contents. "These are notes?" I asked, leaning over his shoulder. "Notes, yes," Holmes replied. "But not just any notes. They're from Markham's private journals. They're written in a hand that is unmistakably his. But the contents? Watson, these aren't the words of a man preparing for his own death. They're the words of someone who knows they are being watched." Harcourt nodded, his face pale. "Exactly. And more than that, There's something else, something far stranger. The entries in the journals appear to span several weeks, but there are gaps where entire days seem to have disappeared. And the last entry, it's dated 2 days ago, Holmes. 2 days ago, and it speaks of a meeting, but there's no description of who he was meeting with. And then there's a final sentence. They know I know. Holmes looked up sharply, his expression unreadable. And you believe these notes are authentic? I do, Harcourt said, voice trembling. But there's more. A man came to see me yesterday. He said he had information about Markham. He spoke in vague terms, but when I pressed him, he claimed that Markham was alive and that he had seen him. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Alive, he repeated. This is the first concrete sign we've had. I think it's time to investigate further, Watson. We set off immediately to follow up on the new lead. Harcourt had been told to meet the mysterious informant at a small tavern near Covent Garden, a dark, smoke-filled establishment known for catering to those who preferred to remain unseen. When we arrived, we were met by a man who introduced himself as Tom Griggs, a former associate of Markham's from his early years in law. Griggs was nervous, fidgeting with his hat as he looked around the room, his eyes darting between us. Markham is alive, Griggs said, his voice hoarse. I saw him 2 days ago, just as I said. But he's not the same. He's changed, Holmes. There's something wrong with him. Holmes leaned in, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean, not the same? Griggs swallowed hard. I don't know exactly, but he's not himself. He looks the same, but his eyes, they're different. And the way he spoke to me, as if he didn't even know me, as if he didn't remember me at all. It was like he was someone else entirely. I watched Holmes closely as he absorbed this information. You say you saw him 2 days ago. Where? In a back alley off Fleet Street. He was with someone, a tall man in a dark coat. They spoke for a moment, but I couldn't hear the conversation. Then Markham left. I tried to approach him, but he turned away from me, like he didn't even recognize me. And then, the man, whoever he was, pulled him away, and they disappeared into the shadows. Holmes remained silent for a long moment, considering this new piece of the puzzle. At last, he spoke. This confirms what I have suspected. Markham is alive, Watson. But whether he is the man he once was is another matter entirely. What do you mean? I asked, confused. Holmes's gaze was distant, his thoughts already moving ahead. The erasure of Markham is not simply a matter of disappearance. It is a matter of transformation. Someone is altering his very identity, making him someone else. I shivered at the implications of this. If Markham had been changed in this way, then the stakes were higher than we had thought. It was no longer a case of missing persons, but a battle for the very soul of a man. As we left the tavern, Holmes's voice was calm but resolute. We must find Markham, and we must find the man who has been shaping him into someone else. Only then will we uncover the true nature of the crime that has been committed. And as the fog rolled in thick around us, I had the distinct feeling that we were standing at the edge of a vast and unfathomable mystery, one that would test not only our wits, but our very understanding of what it means to be human. The revelation imparted by Tom Griggs cast a long shadow over our subsequent days, for it transformed what had been an intellectual puzzle into something far more disturbing. that Julian Markham might be alive yet altered, estranged not merely from society, but from his own past, introduced a psychological dimension that neither Holmes nor I could afford to ignore. The notion that a man might walk the streets of London stripped of his former self, guided or constrained by another's design, struck me as more chilling than any ordinary act of violence. Holmes, however, did not indulge in speculation for its own sake. He returned at once to first principles. A man does not forget himself without cause, he said, as we walked the embankment the following morning, the Thames flowing beside us in sluggish silence. Memory may be impaired by injury, illness, or intoxication, but selective erasure, Watson, that is almost always engineered. You believe Markham has been subjected to some form of coercion? I asked. Coercion, suggestion, repetition, Holmes replied. The mind, like the law, is susceptible to precedent. Tell it something often enough, surround it with confirming evidence, and it will begin to accept the fiction as fact. We had arranged to meet Griggs again, for Holmes was dissatisfied with the vagueness of his account. The man's nervousness, while understandable, suggested either fear or fabrication. Holmes intended to determine which. We found Griggs in a lodging house near Clerkenwell, a narrow, ill-lit place whose stairs creaked beneath our feet. He admitted us reluctantly, glancing over his shoulder before bolting the door. You said you wanted more, he muttered. I've told you all I know. Not quite, Holmes said calmly. You told us what you saw. You have not told us why you were there. Griggs shifted uneasily. I was following him. Out of concern? Out of curiosity, Griggs admitted. When a man vanishes and is declared dead, and then rumors reach you that he has been seen, well, I wanted to know the truth. And when you saw him, I knew something was wrong. Holmes leaned closer. Describe precisely what was wrong. Griggs closed his eyes briefly. He didn't react, not as Markham would have. He listened when I spoke his name, but it was as if the sound meant nothing to him. And when the other man spoke, Watson, it was like watching a master and a pupil. Markham deferred, waited, obeyed. A man in a dark coat, Holmes prompted. Any other distinguishing features? He wore gloves, Griggs said, even though it wasn't cold. And he spoke softly, but Markham heard him at once. Holmes straightened. Thank you. That will suffice. As we departed, I asked, do you think Griggs is reliable? As reliable as a frightened man can be, Holmes replied. Fear sharpens memory, but dulls judgment. Our next step, Holmes declared, was to trace the man in the dark coat. London, vast though it was, left patterns behind it. Men who moved with purpose, who exerted control over others, did not do so without leaving traces, financial, social, or psychological. We began with Fleet Street, where Griggs claimed to have seen them. Holmes questioned news vendors, printers, and night watchmen with the casual air of a man making idle inquiry. From one, he learned of a gentleman who frequented the area at odd hours, always alone, always well-dressed, and always avoiding conversation. Not a journalist, the man said. Too quiet, but he watches. From another, Holmes learned that this same figure had been seen entering a building near the river, a former warehouse converted into offices. We paid the building a visit. It stood back from the street, its windows dark, its entrance unmarked. Holmes examined the lock, the threshold, the faint scuff marks upon the stone. Recent use, he murmured. But not regular. This is not a place of business. It is a place of meeting. We could not enter without attracting attention, and Holmes was unwilling to do so prematurely. Instead, he resolved to watch. That night, we returned and took up a position across the street, concealed within the shadow of a closed shop. The hours passed slowly. I confess that my thoughts wandered, returning again and again to the image Griggs had painted. Markham alive, yet vacant, moving through the city like a man following a script written by another. Near midnight, the door of the building opened. 2 figures emerged. Even at a distance, I recognized the bearing described by Griggs. The taller man in the dark coat, his movements economical and assured. Beside him walked another man, slightly stooped, his head bowed. "Markham," I whispered. Holmes said nothing, but his posture stiffened. They walked away together, and we followed at a careful distance. The taller man set the pace, never once looking back, while Markham followed with the air of one resigned rather than compelled. They turned into a narrow street, then another, until at last they entered a small house whose curtains were drawn tight. Holmes made a note of the address. "We shall not act tonight," he said softly. "Observation precedes intervention." The following day brought a new complication. The newspapers announced that proceedings to declare Julian Markham legally dead would commence within the week. The language was definitive, the tone confident. The machinery Holmes had described was accelerating. "They mean to fix his death in law before his existence can contradict it," I said. "Exactly," Holmes replied. "Once declared dead, Markham becomes a non-entity. Any appearance he might make can be dismissed as imposture or delusion." "And the man in the dark coat?" "Will vanish," Holmes said, "or assume another identity. Such men rarely stand in the light." That afternoon, Holmes received an unexpected visitor, Lionel Vane. He arrived unannounced, his manner strained but courteous. "I thought it best to speak directly," Vane said. "There are rumors, dangerous ones, that you are interfering in matters beyond your remit." Holmes regarded him coolly. "Interference is a matter of perspective." Vane leaned forward. "Markham is gone. The sooner that is accepted, the better for all concerned." "For whom?" Holmes asked. Vane hesitated. "For the law, for order, and for you." A flicker of anger crossed Vane's face. "You suggest—" "I suggest nothing," Holmes said. "I observe that you are eager for finality." Vane rose abruptly. "You play a dangerous game, Mr. Holmes." "So do you," Holmes replied. "The difference is that I know the rules." After Vane's departure, Holmes was silent for a long time. "He is involved," I said at last. "Indirectly, perhaps," Holmes replied. "But he is not the architect. He lacks patience." "Then who is?" Holmes stood and went to the window. "A man who understands systems, law, memory, habit. A man who knows that the most effective murder leaves the victim breathing." That night, as we watched the house where Markham now appeared to reside, I felt a growing sense of dread. Somewhere within those walls was a man whose life was being dismantled piece by piece, not by force, but by persuasion, repetition, and the steady erosion of self. And the question that haunted me was this: if we reached him too late, if the process were completed, would Julian Markham even wish to be found? For 2 nights, we maintained our watch upon the narrow street where the tall man in the dark coat had led Julian Markham. The house itself offered little to the casual observer. A plain facade, recently repainted, with curtains drawn so tightly that no glimmer of interior light escaped. It was precisely the sort of dwelling that avoided notice by virtue of its ordinariness. Holmes, however, studied it with the same intensity he might have applied to a crime scene drenched in blood. "Observe the windows, Watson," he murmured on the second night, as we sheltered beneath the awning of a closed tobacconist's shop. "Curtains, always drawn, no silhouettes, no reflection." I frowned. Reflection? Yes. In most houses, even with curtains closed, there are moments, lamplight, movement, when glass betrays what lies behind it. Here, nothing. It is deliberate. "You think the windows have been altered?" "I am certain of it." The street was quiet, save for the distant rumble of traffic and the occasional echo of footsteps. Holmes watched with the patience of a hunter, his gaze never lingering too long upon any single detail, yet missing nothing. Near 11 o'clock, the door opened. A tall man emerged alone. He paused on the threshold, adjusting his gloves, then set off at a measured pace. Holmes touched my arm. "Now." We followed at a distance, careful to keep to the shadows. The man walked with purpose but not haste, as though confident that he was unobserved. He crossed Fleet Street, turned south, and entered a building whose discreet brass plate identified it as a consulting practice for mental and nervous disorders. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "As I suspected." "A physician?" I whispered. "Or something close enough to borrow the authority," Holmes replied. "Come, we must learn his name." The next day, Holmes employed methods less direct but no less effective. By noon, he had identified the man as Dr. Augustus Rathbone, a specialist in disorders of memory and identity, whose published writings, obscure but troubling, argued that personality was not fixed, but could be reshaped through controlled environments and repetition. "A man after my own heart," Holmes said dryly, were his ambitions less criminal. We returned that evening to the house. Holmes had devised a plan, and though he did not share all its particulars with me, I could tell from his manner that the time for observation alone had passed. Shortly after midnight, the street was deserted. Holmes approached the house boldly and rang the bell. I remained back, my pulse quickened by the audacity of the act. After a moment, the door opened. Dr. Rathbone stood there, his expression one of mild surprise rather than alarm. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I wondered how long it would take." Holmes smiled faintly. "You anticipated me?" "I anticipated someone," Rathbone replied. "Curiosity is inevitable." Holmes stepped inside, and after a brief hesitation, I followed. The interior of the house was unlike any I had ever seen. The furnishings were sparse, functional, almost institutional. But what struck me most was the absence of mirrors. Not a single reflective surface was visible, not even polished metal or glass. "You have removed every opportunity for self-recognition," Holmes observed. An inspired touch. Rathbone inclined his head. "The self is reinforced by reflection. Remove it, and identity becomes malleable." "And Markham?" Holmes asked. Rathbone gestured toward a door. "You may see for yourself." We entered a small sitting room. Julian Markham sat by the fire reading. He looked up as we entered, and then, to my astonishment, looked away again with polite indifference. "Good evening," Holmes said gently. "Do you know who I am?" Markham considered. "No, he said at last. Should I? Holmes nodded slowly. And your own name? Markham hesitated. I do not believe it matters. The words struck me like a physical blow. Here was the man whose career, whose intellect, whose very presence had once commanded courtrooms. And now he spoke as though his identity were an inconvenience. Rathbone watched with quiet satisfaction. You see, he said, no violence, no confinement, merely guidance. Guidance toward non-existence, Holmes replied. You are killing him in installments. Rathbone smiled. On the contrary, I am freeing him from the burdens of his former life. For a fee, Holmes said. Rathbone's smile faded. You misunderstand. I understand perfectly, Holmes replied. You have convinced him that his past is unreliable. You have altered clocks, intercepted letters, edited documents, and surrounded him with evidence that contradicts his memory. You have made him doubt himself until he surrendered authorship of his own life. Markham looked between them, confusion flickering across his features. Is this true? He asked Rathbone. Rathbone's voice was calm. These men are strangers. They seek to confuse you. Holmes stepped forward. Julian Markham, you are a barrister, a man of formidable intellect. You argued the Crown versus Hollis case with such precision that the judge called it a triumph of reason. Does that mean nothing to you? Markham frowned. I do not recall it. Of course you do not, Rathbone said softly, because it is not part of who you are now. Holmes's eyes blazed. You see, Watson, this is the crime. Not murder, but the theft of a self. Rathbone straightened. You have no proof. I have more than you think, Holmes replied. And you have underestimated one thing. What is that? The resilience of truth, Holmes said. We withdrew that night without further confrontation. Holmes explained his reasoning as we walked back through the empty streets. To remove Markham now would be premature, he said. His mind is still under Rathbone's influence. If we force the issue, the law will side with the doctor, and Markham himself may deny us. Then what can we do? I asked. We must restore doubt, Holmes replied. Not in Markham, but in Rathbone's construction of reality. We must introduce contradictions he cannot explain. Over the next days, Holmes set his plan in motion. Letters began to arrive at the house. Documents from Markham's past, bearing details too precise to dismiss. A former colleague appeared unexpectedly, addressing Markham with familiarity and recounting shared experiences. A clock in the house began, inexplicably, to run fast. Rathbone grew agitated. His control depended upon consistency, and consistency was slipping. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings advanced. A date was set for the formal declaration of death. Holmes smiled grimly when he read the notice. They intend to bury him while he still walks, he said. Very well. Let us see how they manage when the dead man objects. On the eve of the hearing, Holmes and I returned once more to the house. This time, Rathbone was waiting for us, his composure strained. You are interfering dangerously, he said. You are losing control, Holmes replied. And you know it. Markham entered the room. His expression was troubled. I have been remembering things, he said slowly. Things you told me were false. Rathbone turned sharply. You must not listen. Enough, Holmes said. Julian Markham, tomorrow the law will declare you dead. Do you wish to contest it? Markham looked at him, fear and resolve warring in his eyes. If I am dead, he said, then who am I? Holmes answered quietly. You are a man whose life was stolen, and it is time to take it back. As we left, the question hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Tomorrow, London would decide whether Julian Markham existed, or whether the most perfect murder in memory would be allowed to stand, bloodless and complete. The morning of the hearing dawned cold and bright, the sort of clear winter light that renders every edge sharp and every shadow distinct. To my mind, it seemed an ironic contrast to the moral fog which surrounded the proceedings about to take place. Holmes was awake before me, already dressed, his manner calm but charged with the quiet intensity that I had learned to recognize as the prelude to decisive action. "Today, Watson," he said, as he adjusted his cuffs, "we test whether truth still possesses sufficient weight to disturb a legal fiction." The hearing was to be held in a modest but dignified chamber adjoining the offices of the solicitors representing Markham's estate. Though not a full court, it possessed enough official gravity to lend authority to its outcome. The declaration of death, once entered into the records, would have consequences both immediate and irrevocable. When we arrived, the room was already partially filled. Clerks sat with papers neatly arranged, witnesses whispered among themselves, and at the front, the presiding magistrate reviewed documents with an air of practiced detachment. Lionel Vane was present, his posture rigid, his expression carefully neutral. Dr. Rathbone, I noted with a tightening of the chest, was also there, seated slightly apart, his gloved hands folded calmly in his lap. There was, conspicuously, no sign of Julian Markham. "They mean to proceed without him," I whispered. "Of course," Holmes replied. "A corpse is rarely invited to its own burial." The proceedings commenced with a recitation of facts, dates, absences, testimonies, each delivered with a confidence that suggested inevitability. Witnesses spoke of Markham's despondence, of remarks interpreted as farewell, of sightings near the river. Holmes listened attentively, making occasional notes, though I could see by his expression that none of this surprised him. At last, the magistrate cleared his throat. "Unless there is further evidence to be presented," he said, "this hearing will proceed toward objection." The word cut through the room like a blade. Holmes had risen to his feet. "On what grounds?" the magistrate asked, irritation evident. "On the grounds," Holmes replied evenly, "that the subject of these proceedings is neither dead nor absent." A murmur rippled through the room. Vane turned sharply, his composure faltering. "You cannot be serious," he said. Holmes met his gaze. "On the contrary, I am rarely more so." The magistrate frowned. "Mr. Holmes, unless you can produce—" The door at the rear of the chamber opened. Every head turned. Julian Markham entered. For a moment, there was stunned silence. The man who stepped into the room bore the unmistakable physical likeness of the barrister whose death was being declared. He was thinner, paler, and his eyes carried a troubled depth that had not been present in earlier portraits. But it was Markham nonetheless. A gasp escaped someone near the back. Vane half rose from his seat, his face drained of colour. "This is irregular," the magistrate said sharply. "It is inconvenient," Holmes replied, "but it is also conclusive." Markham stood uncertainly, his gaze darting around the room as though it were both familiar and alien to him. Dr. Rathbone rose smoothly. "This man," he said, "is unwell. He suffers from delusions of identity. I can attest—" "You can attest to nothing," Holmes interrupted. "Accept your own methods." Rathbone's eyes hardened. "You overstep yourself." Holmes turned to the magistrate. "I submit that this hearing cannot proceed while the subject is present and breathing. Furthermore, I request that Dr. Augustus Rathbone be examined regarding his involvement in the systematic erosion of Mr. Markham's identity." The room erupted into controlled chaos. The magistrate called for order, clerks whispered urgently, and Vane sat rigid, his jaw clenched. Markham spoke then, his voice hesitant but clear. "I was told I did not exist," he said, "that my memories were unreliable, that my past was a construction." "And what do you believe now?" the magistrate asked, almost despite himself. Markham looked at Holmes. "I believe I was made to forget myself." Holmes seized the moment. He produced documents, letters intercepted and later delivered, appointment ledgers altered and restored, testimony from clerks and colleagues who now recognized the pattern of manipulation. He demonstrated how clocks had been tampered with, how correspondence had been selectively withheld, how witnesses had been guided toward particular interpretations. "This was not murder in the traditional sense," Holmes said. "It was murder by consensus. A man was to be declared dead because it was convenient, profitable to believe him so." Vane leapt to his feet. "This is outrageous." "And yet," Holmes replied, "you stand to inherit." Vane's protest faltered. Rathbone spoke again, his voice controlled. "Even if this man believes himself to be Markham, belief is not proof." Holmes smiled thinly. "Then let us consider proof." He turned to Markham. "Julian Markham, recite the opening argument you delivered in Crown vs. Hollis." Markham hesitated. The room held its breath. Then, slowly, haltingly at first, the words came. Not perfectly, not fluently, but unmistakably. The structure, the phrasing, the logical progression of the argument that had once astonished the court. As he spoke, something changed in him. His voice strengthened. His posture straightened. Memory, stirred by recognition rather than repetition, asserted itself. Rathbone sat back, his confidence visibly shaken. The magistrate raised a hand. "This hearing is adjourned," he said firmly. "Further inquiry is required." As the room began to empty, Holmes leaned toward me. "You see, Watson, identity, like truth, resists erasure. It may be buried, but it is rarely destroyed." Yet the matter was far from resolved. Rathbone was not arrested. Vane was not yet charged. The law, cautious and slow, demanded further proof. That evening, as we returned to Baker Street, Holmes was unusually pensive. "They will not yield easily," he said. "Rathbone in particular. His pride is invested in his experiment." "You think he will act?" I asked. "I think," Holmes replied, "that a man who has come so close to perfecting a bloodless murder will not surrender his masterpiece without one final attempt." As if in answer to his words, a messenger arrived at our door not an hour later, breathless and pale. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "there's been an incident at the house. Dr. Rathbone, he's gone. And Mr. Markham, he's missing." The victory of the day evaporated in an instant, replaced by a familiar dread. Holmes reached for his coat. Then the game enters its final phase. "And Markham?" I asked. Holmes's expression was grim. "If Rathbone has taken him, Watson, it will be to finish what he began, to erase the last contradiction." We stepped back into the night, London once more closing around us, and I could not shake the fear that the deadliest struggle was yet to come. not for Markham's life, but for his very existence. The disappearance of Julian Markham for a second time struck me with a force far greater than the first. Then, there had been uncertainty, conjecture, and the uneasy abstraction of a man who might be dead. Now, there was something far more intimate and dreadful. A man who had stood before us, spoken, remembered, and begun, however falteringly, to reclaim himself, had been seized once more and plunged back into uncertainty. It was not merely a relapse of the case, but an escalation, and Holmes recognized it instantly. "Rathbone has panicked," he said, as we hurried through the streets, the messenger struggling to keep pace behind us. "A theorist, Watson, an intellectual criminal, is most dangerous when his hypothesis is threatened by reality." The house without mirrors lay dark when we arrived. The door stood ajar, swinging slightly in the cold wind, producing a faint rhythmic creak that set my nerves on edge. Holmes paused before entering, surveying the street with the quick, comprehensive glance that so often preceded decisive action. "No crowd," he observed. "No constables. Rathbone did not want witnesses. That suggests haste rather than preparation." Inside, the house bore unmistakable signs of disorder. A chair lay overturned. Papers were scattered across the floor, many torn in half, others crumpled as though discarded in frustration. The oppressive neatness we had previously observed was gone, replaced by the chaos of a plan interrupted. Holmes moved through the rooms with rapid precision. In the sitting room where we had last seen Markham, the fire had burned down to embers. On the mantel, the clock, previously so carefully regulated, had stopped entirely. "Symbolic," Holmes murmured, "or careless. Either way, instructive." "What do you make of it?" I asked. "He has abandoned the experiment," Holmes replied, "which means he intends to conclude it." We ascended to the upper floor. In one of the bedrooms, Holmes stopped short. The bed had been slept in recently, and beside it lay a syringe hastily discarded. My heart lurched. "Drugs?" "Sedatives," Holmes said, examining it closely. "Used not to erase memory, but to suppress resistance. Markham has begun to remember." That made him dangerous. Holmes's gaze swept the room. "Rathbone has taken him somewhere else, somewhere final." "But where?" I asked. "He cannot keep him hidden indefinitely." "No," Holmes replied, "which is why he will not hide him at all." He straightened abruptly, eyes alight. "Watson, what is the one place a man can be without existing?" I stared at him. I don't understand." "A place where presence does not signify life," Holmes continued. "Where absence is expected. Where identity is reduced to a name on a ledger." My breath caught. An asylum. Precisely. We did not return to Baker Street. Instead, Holmes directed a cab toward the outskirts of the city, to one of the newer private institutions that catered to wealthy families, seeking discreet solutions to inconvenient relations. The night grew colder as we traveled, the city giving way to darker, quieter roads, lined with bare trees whose branches clawed at the sky. The asylum stood behind high iron gates, its stone facade illuminated by a handful of lamps that cast long, distorted shadows across the grounds. Holmes paid the driver and approached the entrance with confident authority. Inside, the air was heavy with antiseptic and silence. A night attendant met us, his manner cautious. "We are here regarding a patient admitted this evening," Holmes said smoothly. "Julian Markham." The attendant frowned. That name is not. Holmes produced a folded document. Emergency authorization, signed by Dr. Rathbone. The man hesitated, then nodded. Very well, but visiting hours do not apply, Holmes said firmly, when a man has been committed under false pretenses. We were led down a long corridor, its walls bare, its doors uniformly closed. From behind one, I heard a faint murmur, indistinct but undeniably human. The sound sent a chill through me. At last, we stopped before a door at the far end. The attendant unlocked it and stepped aside. Markham sat on the bed, his head in his hands. He looked up as we entered, his eyes clouded but not vacant. "Mr. Holmes," he said hoarsely, "I was afraid. I had imagined you." Holmes crossed the room in 2 strides. "You did not," he said, "and you will not if I have anything to say about it." Markham's voice trembled. "He told me I was dangerous, that my memories were lies, that the law would lock me away if I insisted on being someone I was not." Holmes's expression hardened. "That, Mr. Markham, is the oldest trick in tyranny." Before he could say more, footsteps sounded in the corridor. Dr. Rathbone appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 orderlies. "This is highly improper," Rathbone said coldly. "You have no authority here." Holmes turned slowly. "On the contrary, you no longer have any." Rathbone smiled thinly. "You misunderstand the nature of authority, Mr. Holmes. These men answer to me." "Do they?" Holmes asked. "Or do they answer to the law?" He produced another document, this one bearing an official seal. "A warrant, issued less than an hour ago, for your arrest, Dr. Rathbone, on charges of unlawful confinement, fraud, and conspiracy." The orderlies hesitated. Rathbone's smile faltered. "You think this ends it?" Rathbone said quietly. "You think restoring one man's memory undoes my work?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that you have confused influence with inevitability." Rathbone laughed bitterly as the orderlies took him by the arms. "You are a relic, Holmes. The future belongs to men who understand that identity is negotiable." Holmes watched him go, his expression unreadable. When at last we emerged into the cold night air with Markham between us, I felt a profound sense of relief, but also a lingering unease. "Is it truly over?" I asked. "For Markham," Holmes said. "Yes." "For the idea Rathbone represented?" "No." Markham paused, looking back at the building. "He nearly succeeded," he said softly. "There were moments when I wanted to disappear, when non-existence seemed peaceful." Holmes met his gaze. "That is why his crime is so insidious. He did not merely erase, he tempted." As we escorted Markham away, the asylum receded into darkness behind us. Yet I could not help but feel that the case had touched something fundamental and dangerous. A truth about how easily a man might be persuaded to surrender himself, not through force, but through doubt. And as London slept on, unaware of how close it had come to accepting a living man's death as fact, I wondered how many other shadows walked its streets, alive, breathing, yet already erased in the eyes of the world. Though Julian Markham had been recovered from the asylum and Dr. Rathbone placed under arrest, Holmes was the first to insist that the case had not yet reached its true conclusion. Rescue, he maintained, was not resolution. The city might momentarily be satisfied by the spectacle of a villain unmasked and a victim restored, but the deeper mechanisms that had allowed such a crime to unfold still turned, unseen and unchallenged. "You mistake the nature of this affair, Watson," he said on the morning following Markham's return to Baker Street, where the poor man now occupied our spare bedroom under Holmes's careful supervision. Rathbone was not the engine. He was a cog. Remove him and the machine may still function. Markham, though physically unharmed, bore unmistakable signs of his ordeal. His sleep was restless, punctuated by waking moments of disorientation. At times, he spoke with clarity and authority, recalling cases, colleagues, arguments once made before the bench. At others, he faltered, seized by doubt, as though fearful that memory itself might betray him again. "I keep expecting someone to contradict me," he confessed to me quietly that afternoon. "To tell me that what I remember is convenient fiction." "That fear," Holmes observed later, "is Rathbone's most enduring legacy. It will take time and evidence to dispel it." Evidence, however, was precisely what the law demanded next. Within days, Holmes and I found ourselves drawn into a complex legal struggle that threatened to entangle the case in procedural ambiguity. Rathbone's solicitor, a man of sharp intellect and colder conscience, argued that Markham's reappearance did not in itself invalidate the earlier proceedings. If Markham's identity or sanity could be called into question, the declaration of death might yet stand. "It is an extraordinary position," I said bitterly, after Holmes returned from one such consultation. "They propose to argue that a living man is legally dead." "Extraordinary, yes," Holmes replied, "but not unprecedented. The law, Watson, values certainty above truth. If truth disrupts established certainty, it is often treated as the intruder." Complicating matters further was Lionel Vane. Though publicly circumspect, his private maneuvers grew increasingly bold. Holmes intercepted correspondence suggesting that Vane was pressing for a swift settlement of the estate, hoping to secure his inheritance before the courts could unravel the matter entirely. "He believes momentum is on his side," Holmes said, "a common mistake." Yet even Holmes appeared troubled by one aspect of the case that refused to settle into clarity. Despite exhaustive investigation, no direct evidence had emerged to prove that Vane had conspired with Rathbone from the outset. Their interests aligned, certainly, but alignment was not conspiracy. "We have motive," Holmes said one evening, pacing the sitting room. "We have opportunity. What we lack is proof of design." "And Rathbone?" I asked. "Surely he will testify." "Rathbone will say only what preserves his vanity," Holmes replied. "He will present himself as a misunderstood pioneer, not as a hired instrument." That same night, another unsettling development occurred. Markham received a letter. It was unsigned, delivered without postmark, and contained only a single sentence: "You were more at peace when you did not exist." Markham's hand shook as he passed it to Holmes. "A remnant," Holmes said grimly, "either of Rathbone's influence or of someone who shares his philosophy." "You think Rathbone has accomplices?" I asked. "I think ideas are rarely solitary," Holmes replied, "and those who profit from them are seldom idle." The following days were marked by subtle but persistent pressure. Anonymous articles appeared in certain papers, questioning Markham's mental stability. Rumors circulated of nervous collapse, of delusion, of breakdown under professional strain. Each was carefully worded, plausibly sourced, and impossible to refute without further publicity. "They are attempting to reframe the narrative," Holmes said. "If Markham cannot be erased, he can be discredited. Markham himself grew increasingly distressed. "I am being tried," he said one night, "without ever stepping into a courtroom." Holmes placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Not without counsel," he said, "and not without witnesses." It was then that Holmes resolved upon a bold and dangerous strategy to confront the machinery of reputation directly. "We shall give London a fact it cannot ignore," he said. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A public legal symposium was announced at the Middle Temple, an event Markham had once chaired, now to be held in his absence. Holmes insisted that Markham attend. "But I am not," Markham began. "You are precisely what they fear," Holmes interrupted. "Present, articulate, unburied." The hall was crowded when we arrived. I could feel the tension ripple through the audience as Markham entered beside Holmes. Whispers followed him like a physical force. The proceedings began stiffly. Then Holmes rose. "Gentlemen," he said, "you gather to discuss jurisprudence while committing its most egregious offense, the denial of observable reality." He invited Markham to speak. What followed was one of the most extraordinary moments I have ever witnessed. Markham spoke, not defensively, but deliberately. He described in measured detail the process by which his identity had been dismantled, the altered documents, the manipulated timepieces, the isolation, the repetition. He did not plead. He explained. As he spoke, I saw recognition dawn in several faces. Not sympathy, but comprehension. When he concluded, the silence was profound. Yet even then, the matter was not settled. A man rose at the back of the hall, a stranger to me, and asked calmly, "And how are we to be certain that this account is not itself a construction?" Holmes turned toward him instantly. "An excellent question," he said. "One which brings us, at last, to the true accomplice in this crime." The man stiffened. "You see," Holmes continued, "this case required not merely a doctor nor a beneficiary, but an arbiter of credibility, someone who understood how narratives are accepted, someone who could see doubt at precisely the right moments." The stranger attempted to leave. Holmes's voice rang out. "Mr. Aldous Crane, editor of the Judicial Review, you will remain." A collective murmur swept the hall. Holmes explained swiftly and devastatingly how Crane had been supplied with selective information by Rathbone, how he had shaped opinion under the guise of impartial commentary, and how he stood to gain professionally from the sensation of a vanished man declared dead. Crane protested, of course, but Holmes had documents, letters, drafts, timelines. The law, Holmes concluded, was not deceived. It was persuaded, and persuasion, when deliberate and concealed, is conspiracy. The consequences were immediate, though not final. Investigations were ordered, proceedings delayed. Rathbone's defense weakened. Vane's position grew precarious. That night, as we returned to Baker Street, Markham walked more steadily than I had yet seen him. "For the first time," he said quietly, "I felt real." Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. "Reality," he said, "is not bestowed. It is asserted and defended." Yet even as the case turned in our favor, Holmes remained vigilant. He knew, as I did, that men who attempt such crimes rarely surrender all their contingencies at once. And somewhere in London, I felt certain, someone was still asking whether a murder without a body might yet succeed. If only the victim could be persuaded not to exist. If there was one quality Holmes possessed in abundance, Beyond his powers of observation and deduction, it was an instinctive distrust of apparent victory. The exposure of Aldous Crane and the public reassertion of Julian Markham's identity might have satisfied a lesser investigator. But to Holmes, these events represented not an end, but a transition. The structure of the crime had been revealed, yet its foundation still demanded dismantling. "The danger now, Watson," he remarked as we sat late into the night amid a clutter of documents, "is complacency. When men believe they have witnessed justice, they stop looking for its counterfeit." Markham slept fitfully in the adjoining room, his presence a constant reminder of the case's human cost. I had observed a change in him since the symposium, not a restoration precisely, but a strengthening. He spoke with greater assurance, yet his eyes retained a watchfulness that suggested a man newly aware of how fragile certainty might be. The following morning brought confirmation of Holmes's concerns. A notice appeared in the Gazette. While the declaration of death had been suspended pending further inquiry, it had not been revoked. In the eyes of the law, Markham existed in a liminal state, neither alive nor dead, his legal identity effectively frozen. "They hedge," I said angrily. "They refuse to commit." "They protect themselves," Holmes replied. "To revoke the declaration is to admit error. Institutions rarely do so without resistance." More troubling still was the emergence of a new narrative, subtle but persistent. Certain commentators began to suggest that Markham's ordeal had been exaggerated by Holmes for dramatic effect. The phrase psychological episode appeared with increasing frequency, as did insinuations that Markham's reappearance was the result of manipulation rather than recovery. "They are moving the goalposts," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and they have found new players." The identity of those players soon became apparent. Holmes received a visit from Sir Edmund Halverton, a senior figure in the Home Office whose reputation for discretion bordered on opacity. He arrived in the afternoon, impeccably dressed, his manner courteous but guarded. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "you have stirred waters that were once still." Holmes gestured him to a chair. "Stagnant water breeds disease," he replied. "I consider the disturbance a public service." Halverton smiled thinly. "Be that as it may, there are concerns. The notion that a man might be declared dead in error, through conspiracy no less, has unsettling implications." "For those responsible," Holmes said. "For the public," Halverton corrected. "Confidence in our institutions is not easily restored once shaken." Holmes's eyes hardened. "Confidence built on falsehood is merely ignorance in uniform." Halverton leaned forward. "There are those who believe that continued attention to this case serves no one, that Mr. Markham would be better served by discretion." "By silence," Holmes said. "By erasure." Halverton did not deny it. "By peace." Holmes rose. "Peace purchased at the cost of truth is not peace. It is surrender." The interview ended without resolution, but its significance was unmistakable. Holmes had crossed from the realm of private investigation into something more dangerous, the exposure of systemic vulnerability. That evening, Holmes shared with me a discovery he had withheld until now. From Rathbone's papers, seized but not yet fully examined, Holmes had extracted a notebook containing references to prior subjects. "There were others," Holmes said quietly. Not erased so completely as Markham, but altered, redirected, marginalized. My blood ran cold. You mean this was not an isolated experiment? No, Holmes replied. It was a refinement. One entry in particular caught my eye. It referenced a clerk dismissed for instability, later institutionalized. Another described a woman declared unfit to manage her estate after expressing inconvenient political views. These people, I said, were not murdered. Nor were they allowed to live as themselves, Holmes replied. Rathbone provided a method. Others provided opportunity. The implications were staggering. If identity itself could be challenged, manipulated, and overridden under the guise of care or legality, then the boundaries of crime extended far beyond physical harm. Holmes resolved to force a reckoning, not merely for Markham, but for the principle at stake. We require an incontrovertible demonstration, he said, something that cannot be dismissed as opinion or interpretation. And how do you propose to obtain it? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. By compelling the system to contradict itself. Within days, Holmes had arranged a formal medical evaluation of Markham, conducted not by any English physician, but by a visiting neurologist from Vienna, a man of international repute with no connection to Rathbone or his circle. The examination was exhaustive, public, and meticulously documented. The results were unequivocal. Markham's memory impairment was consistent with prolonged psychological manipulation, not inherent delusion. His identity, far from fabricated, exhibited continuity disrupted by external interference. When the report was published, it caused a sensation. The legal press was forced to reconsider. The Home Office, suddenly cautious, announced a full inquiry into Rathbone's methods and associations. Yet, even then, resistance remained. A final obstacle emerged in the form of a sealed affidavit, submitted anonymously, claiming that Markham himself had once sought Rathbone's assistance in order to escape professional disgrace. "It is a lie," Markham said flatly when Holmes showed it to him. "I know," Holmes replied, "but it is a useful one." "Useful?" I echoed. "Yes," Holmes said, "because lies, when examined closely, reveal the hands that crafted them." Holmes traced the affidavit's language, its peculiar phrasing, its legal cadence. Within hours, he had identified its author, Lionel Vane. "He makes his last stand," Holmes said, "and in doing so, exposes himself." Vane was confronted with the evidence, drafts, correspondence, payments. His composure crumbled. Faced with the prospect of indictment for conspiracy and fraud, he attempted to negotiate. "You cannot undo what has already been accepted," he said desperately. "The world wants closure." "The world," Holmes replied, "will have truth." With Vane's collapse, the structure finally gave way. The declaration of death was formally revoked. Rathbone was charged not only with unlawful confinement, but with systematic psychological abuse. Aldous Crane resigned in disgrace. For Markham, the resolution was quieter, yet profound. One evening, as we sat together in Baker Street, he turned to Holmes. "You gave me back more than my life," he said. "You gave me permission to exist." Holmes shook his head. "You reclaimed it? I merely removed the obstacles." As for myself, I found that the case had altered my understanding of crime. I had seen bodies broken before, but never identity so nearly destroyed. And as London resumed its accustomed rhythms, I could not help but wonder How many other lives depended upon the quiet assumption that existence itself was secure, unaware of how easily certainty might be forged, and how vigilant one must be to remain, in every sense, alive. In the days that followed the formal revocation of Julian Markham's legal death, London reacted not with outrage, as one might have expected, but with a curious restraint. The newspapers reported the matter with caution, emphasizing procedural correction rather than moral failure. Rathbone's name appeared in print, certainly, but always framed as an aberration, an unfortunate excess of theory rather than the natural consequence of unchecked authority. Holmes observed this with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "They are treating the symptom," he remarked as we read the morning papers together, while carefully avoiding the disease. Markham himself remained with us, though he had resumed the use of his own house during the day. Holmes insisted that he not be left alone at night, a precaution Markham accepted without protest. He had, I noted, developed a profound wariness of solitude, not from fear of physical harm, but from a lingering dread of mental isolation. "There are moments," he confessed to me one evening, "when the silence feels accusatory, as though my thoughts are on trial." "You have endured an ordeal few could withstand," I replied. "Recovery will not be immediate." He nodded. "Nor complete, perhaps, but at least now the doubt is mine, and not imposed." Holmes, meanwhile, had turned his attention to the broader implications of the case. Rathbone's papers, now fully examined, revealed a network of correspondence, academics, editors, administrators, none of whom could be directly implicated in criminal acts, yet all of whom had contributed in some measure to the climate that allowed such acts to flourish. "It is a distributed crime," Holmes said. "No single villain, no single weapon. Responsibility diluted until it appears harmless." One name among the papers intrigued him particularly: Sir Edmund Halverton. Though careful never to commit himself explicitly, Halverton's memoranda revealed a consistent pattern of discouraging scrutiny, redirecting inquiries and reframing controversies in the interest of what he termed institutional stability. "Stability," Holmes observed dryly, "is often the euphemism of those who benefit from inertia." Yet Halverton was beyond the reach of prosecution. His actions, while ethically questionable, remained within the letter of the law. Holmes accepted this with philosophical resignation, though I sensed his irritation. "The law," he said, "is a mirror held up to society. It reflects what we tolerate." Markham's professional reinstatement proceeded slowly. Some clients returned at once, eager to align themselves with a man whose ordeal had captured public imagination. Others remained distant, uncertain whether association with him might yet prove inconvenient. Markham bore this with outward composure, though I could see the toll it took. "I was erased once," he said quietly. "Now I must prove myself again, as though reborn, but without the innocence of beginnings." One afternoon, as Holmes and I walked together along the river, he surprised me by speaking of the case in unusually personal terms. "You know, Watson," he said, "this affair unsettled me more than most." "Because of its scope?" I asked. "Because of its premise," he replied. "I have always believed that reason, applied rigorously, could restore order. But here we saw reason itself employed as a weapon, logic used to dismantle a man." "You defeated it," I said. "For now," Holmes replied, "but the method remains. and it requires no genius to replicate, only patience and authority. That evening brought a final, unexpected development. A letter arrived at Baker Street bearing Rathbone's handwriting. It had been written from prison. "You believe you have won," it read. "But you misunderstand. I failed not because the method is flawed, but because I was premature. Society is not yet ready to accept what I demonstrated. It will be. When it is, men like Markham will thank us for relieving them of the burden of self." Holmes read the letter without visible reaction, then placed it carefully into the fire. "Delusion," I said. "No," Holmes replied. "Conviction, which is far more dangerous." As the flames consumed the paper, I felt a profound sense of unease. The case was closed, the victim restored, the criminal exposed. Yet the idea at its heart remained uncomfortably alive. Later that night, Markham joined us in the sitting room. He looked tired, but there was a steadiness in him I had not seen before. "I leave London tomorrow," he said. "For a time, I need distance. From the city, from the case, from myself." Holmes nodded. "A wise decision. Identity, like bone, must be allowed to knit." Markham smiled faintly. "I owe you my existence." "You owe yourself persistence," Holmes replied. "Never surrender authorship." After Markham retired, I turned to Holmes. "Will we ever truly prevent such crimes?" Holmes gazed into the dying embers of the fire. "We can expose them," he said. "We can interrupt them. But prevention requires vigilance not only from detectives, but from society itself." As I later set down these events, I realized that this case had altered not only my understanding of crime, but of life. For if a man may be murdered without a wound, erased without violence, then existence itself becomes something that must be defended, not merely lived. And in that realization lay the most unsettling truth of all, that the most dangerous murders are those in which the victim is persuaded to participate. The streets of London were quiet that night, indifferent as ever. Yet somewhere beneath their familiar rhythms, I felt certain that new questions were already forming. Questions about memory, authority, and the fragile contract by which a man is allowed to be himself. Time, which in this case had been wielded so effectively as a weapon, now resumed its more familiar role as healer and eroder alike. Weeks passed after Julian Markham's departure from London, and though the city's attention gradually drifted to fresher scandals and newer sensations, Holmes remained preoccupied with what he termed the residue of doubt. By this, he meant not the doubts that afflicted Markham. Those, he believed, would fade with distance and reaffirmed habit. But the doubts left behind in the minds of those who had watched a living man declared dead and then quietly restored. "Observe the subtlety of it, Watson," he said one evening, as we sat amid a fresh scattering of newspapers and correspondence. "No one denies the correction. They merely refuse to dwell upon it. The lesson is permitted to exist only briefly, lest it unsettle too much." I had noticed it myself. The Markham affair, once so eagerly devoured, was now treated as an unfortunate anomaly, an embarrassment best forgotten. Rathbone's trial was reported in cautious terms, his methods described as excessive rather than monstrous, his philosophy dismissed as eccentric rather than dangerous. "They wish to believe him unique," I said. "And therefore harmless," Holmes replied. "If the threat is singular, it need not be addressed systemically." It was during this period of apparent calm that Holmes received an invitation which, at first glance, seemed innocuous enough. A request to consult on a minor case involving disputed identity in a provincial matter. Ordinarily, Holmes would have declined such a diversion. Yet something in the phrasing caught his attention. "They appeal not to my skill," he observed, "but to my discretion." The case concerned a man named Frederick Nolan, a clerk in a manufacturing firm in Birmingham, who had recently been declared mentally incompetent following a series of alleged delusions regarding his employer's accounting practices. Nolan insisted that certain ledgers had been altered and that he was being silenced for noticing it. His family, encouraged by the firm's solicitors, had consented to his confinement in a private institution. "Another Rathbone?" I asked. "Not quite," Holmes said, "but the silhouette is familiar." We travelled north the following day. The journey afforded Holmes ample opportunity for reflection, and he spoke more freely than usual. "Rathbone's crime was ambitious," he said. "Too ambitious. He sought to erase a prominent man, and in doing so drew scrutiny. Lesser practitioners will be more cautious. They will aim lower, quieter. The institution housing Nolan was smaller than the London asylum, less imposing and more respectable in appearance. Its superintendent, a genial man with a fondness for euphemism, assured us that Nolan was well cared for. "He suffers from a persecution complex," the superintendent explained, "entirely self-generated." Holmes listened politely, then asked to see Nolan. The man we encountered bore a striking resemblance to Markham as I had first seen him at the hearing, thin, anxious, and painfully alert. He greeted Holmes with a mixture of hope and fear. "They say I imagine things," Nolan said rapidly, "that I invent patterns. But the figures don't lie, Mr. Holmes. Someone has been adjusting the books." Holmes asked him to explain. Nolan did so with remarkable clarity. The details were technical, precise, and, most tellingly, consistent. Afterward, Holmes requested to see the ledgers in question. The firm's representatives protested, but Holmes's reputation carried weight. When at last the books were produced, Holmes examined them with care. "These alterations," he said quietly to me, "are real." "What will you do?" I asked. Holmes closed the ledger. "The same thing as before. Introduce contradiction." Within days, the firm's accounts were subjected to independent audit. Discrepancies emerged. Nolan was released, quietly and without apology. The firm issued a statement citing clerical error. As we returned to London, I sensed Holmes's mood darken rather than lift. "You have saved another man," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and tomorrow there will be another." "Surely that cannot be your burden alone." Holmes looked out the window, the countryside blurring past. "It is no one man's burden. That is precisely the problem." Back in Baker Street, a letter awaited us. This one from Markham. He wrote from the continent, his tone steadier, more assured. "I find that memory returns not all at once, but in layers," he wrote. "Some days I am wholly myself. On others, I feel like an archivist of my own life, consulting records rather than recollections. Yet I persist, and I am grateful." Holmes read the letter twice before placing it carefully in his drawer. "Persistence," he murmured. "Yes, that is the antidote." Yet even as Markham rebuilt his life, Holmes remained convinced that the case's true danger lay not in its perpetrators, but in its plausibility. The idea that identity could be challenged, redefined, or nullified through administrative means had proven all too workable. One need not persuade the victim entirely, Holmes said one night. Only enough to delay resistance until the world decides for him. It was then that Holmes undertook a curious project. He began compiling what he called a negative archive, a record of cases not officially recognized as crimes, but which shared certain characteristics: disputed identity, coerced incompetence, administrative erasure. "You mean to publish this?" I asked. "No," Holmes replied. "Publication invites distortion. This is for reference, for pattern." "And if you are gone?" I asked, struck by an uncharacteristic apprehension. Holmes regarded me steadily. "Then you will know what to look for." The weight of that responsibility settled upon me with unexpected force. I had always been content to record Holmes's triumphs, to set them down as closed narratives with satisfying conclusions. Yet this case resisted closure. Its tendrils extended beyond Rathbone, beyond Vane, beyond even Markham. It suggested a future in which the most devastating crimes would leave no visible wounds, only absences, doubts, and quiet revisions of reality. One evening, as fog once more gathered outside our windows, Holmes spoke with a gravity I had seldom heard. "Watson," he said, "there may come a time when men will ask not who committed the crime, but who is permitted to exist." "And when that time comes?" I asked. Holmes's eyes reflected the lamplight, sharp and unwavering. "Then detection will no longer be a matter of chasing criminals. It will be a matter of defending truth itself." The fire burned low as he spoke, casting long shadows across the room. And in those shadows, I could almost see the outlines of future cases, quieter, subtler, and infinitely more perilous than any corpse upon a slab. For a murder without a body leaves behind something far harder to confront than death. It leaves behind uncertainty. It is a curious peculiarity of memory that some cases conclude not with a single decisive moment, but with a gradual crystallization of meaning. In the weeks that followed our return from Birmingham, life in Baker Street resumed a semblance of its accustomed rhythm. Clients came and went. Holmes alternated between periods of languid inactivity and bursts of intense focus. To any casual observer, the affair of Julian Markham might have appeared concluded, filed away among those singular episodes which, once explained, lose their power to disturb. Yet I knew better, and so did Holmes. The case, though outwardly resolved, continued to exert a subtle pressure upon his mind. He spoke of it rarely, but when he did, it was with the air of a man contemplating not a solved problem, but a revealed principle. "The criminal imagination evolves," he said one afternoon, as we sat by the window watching the slow procession of carriages below. "It abandons the crude and embraces the efficient. Why risk blood, Watson, when paper suffices? Why dispose of a body when one may dispose of certainty?" I was struck by the phrasing. "Then you believe," I said, "that this method, this erasure, will recur?" "I believe it already has," Holmes replied. "We merely lacked the vocabulary to recognize it." The final reckoning of the Markham affair came unexpectedly, not through the courts, but through death, an ordinary, unmistakable death which stood in stark contrast to the bloodless phantom we had spent months pursuing. Dr. Augustus Rathbone died in prison. The news reached us on a fog-heavy morning, delivered with the casual finality of an item already deemed unremarkable. Rathbone had been found in his cell, seated upright upon his cot, his hands folded neatly in his lap. There were no signs of struggle, no note, no obvious cause beyond what the physician termed cardiac failure. "Convenient," I remarked bitterly. Holmes read the notice in silence, then folded the paper with care. "Inevitable," he said at last. "You do not suspect foul play?" "No," Holmes replied. "Rathbone was not the sort of man others kill. He was the sort who kills himself slowly, by certainty." I did not understand him then, but in time his meaning became clear. Rathbone's death effectively closed the remaining avenues of inquiry. Without his testimony, several threads remained unprovable. The Home Office, relieved of further embarrassment, allowed the matter to settle into quiet obscurity. Lionel Vane, having escaped prison by surrendering most of his inheritance, withdrew from public life and was soon forgotten. Aldous Crane vanished into the provinces, his influence extinguished. And Julian Markham. A letter arrived from him some months later, written from Italy. His hand was steady, his tone reflective. "I have resumed work, cautiously and privately. I find that my mind no longer fears itself. There are gaps still, rooms I hesitate to enter, but they no longer terrify me. I understand now that memory is not possession, but practice." Holmes read the letter once, nodded, and placed it among his papers. "That," he said, "is as much restoration as one may reasonably expect." It was only after Rathbone's death that Holmes at last allowed himself to articulate what the case had meant to him. One evening, as the fire burned low and the city outside lay muffled in fog, he spoke with an uncharacteristic gravity. "You know, Watson," he said, "this was never about whether Markham lived or died." "No," I asked. "It was about whether death requires a body." The words lingered between us. "Consider," Holmes continued, "what constitutes murder. We assume a physical end, a cessation of breath, a stilling of the heart. But Markham was brought perilously close to non-existence without any such finality. His name was transferred, his time was altered, his memory was discredited. Had we arrived weeks later, the world would have absorbed his absence as fact." "And he himself?" I asked. Holmes's gaze was steady. He might have done the same. The full horror of that realization settled upon me then. A man could be murdered not by violence, but by persuasion, by the steady accumulation of doubt, until resistance seemed irrational. "There was no body," I said slowly, "because the crime required none." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "The body is merely evidence. Remove the need for evidence, and you remove the obstacle to perfect crime." I asked him then the question that had troubled me since the beginning. If we had failed, if Markham had been declared dead and accepted it himself, what would have remained of him? Holmes considered before answering. A pensioner's footnote, a disputed will, a line in a ledger, enough to distribute property, but not enough to disturb conscience. The fire crackled softly. Somewhere below, a cab passed, its sound distorted by the fog. "It is fashionable," Holmes went on, "to speak of progress, but progress without vigilance merely refines cruelty. Rathbone believed himself a pioneer. In truth, he was a herald, an early voice of something that will return." "And what shall we do when it does?" I asked. Holmes met my gaze. "What we always do. We insist upon observation, upon contradiction, upon the stubborn reality of the human individual." He rose then and went to the window, peering out into the murk. "London," he said, "is a city built upon records, births, deaths, deeds, judgments. It trusts its paper more than its people. That trust is its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. I thought of Julian Markham, alive yet nearly extinguished, of Nolan, quietly institutionalized, of others unnamed, whose identities might even now be under negotiation by unseen hands. The case had ended without a corpse, without a confession, without the dramatic certainties that satisfy the popular imagination. And yet, of all the cases I have recorded, none left a deeper impression upon me, for I had seen a man pronounced dead who still breathed. I had seen a murder committed without blood, and I had learned that existence itself may be contested. As I set down these final words, I do so with a sense of unease and of duty. For the lesson of this case is not merely that crimes may take new forms, but that vigilance must evolve with them. There was no body, and that, I now understand, was the most terrifying detail